Well, welcome again to GPS. We're here together, and I don't know if we can take 30 seconds or a minute and say where you've been since the last time we were together. I just flew in from Vietnam and Mexico. Where have you been since the last time we talked?
I don't remember.
Putting everything together while I was gone.
I was babysitting the church while you were gone.
Yeah, it was really quite an experience. I don't know if you've had a chance to go. I was the second to get permit to speak in Vietnam, as an American anyway. And so you have to be very careful with all the arrangements. And we had advisors from the government in every message I spoke at. But they were lovely people and greeted us, and we got along well. There were a couple things we had to work out. So I was in Saigon, and then a place up in a mountain, big church that we've helped build a lot, and then Da Nang, and then Hanoi. I had one night in Hanoi.
That's cool.
Very small group, but I had fun with them. They're trying to reach to 4 million people. You all know Ted Wilson. I'll give him credit. In the sermon of the General Conference, the last General Conference, where he was elected again, out of all the countries of the world, made an appeal for Hanoi to have some land. That land was $3 million a piece, and I looked at that land. They're not getting that, and they bought a building for $1.8 million that is completely done, 7 floors, elevators, tile floor, brand new, and they hope to, in the next few weeks, get a permit and open that building up. But they bought it. It's done. It's the Adventist Church is building now.
Wow.
So very exciting.
That's pretty cool.
Scary. Who's going to do it? They're going to have a food place and a bookstore and an English language school and music school, all community programs.
Hey.
So John McCain somehow didn't show up at his prison like he did last time when we went through. But anyway, we had a good experience. Just came back from building a house in Mexico. So where have you been since we talked last?
Well, my life has been pretty boring the last couple of weeks, but you made me think of a time I was in a country not too far from Vietnam where you had to give the topics of all your lectures to get a visa. And just before I got up to speak, someone came up to me and says, by the way, the head of intelligence of this country is here to monitor what you're saying. And okay, that's interesting. And after it was over, I says, how did it go? And he said, well, actually, he thought it was better than some of the CIA briefings he'd had recently.
Oh, so good. Well,
I guess I survived, and they let us complete the series. So
that's so funny.
And we had that. I mean, they asked me. We had a meeting finally after a couple questions and gift giving, and tea and all of that. And they asked me if I had been in the war, what was my attitude before the war, and I've been in Vietnam before. We had a lot of, but before we were done, they had quite a discussion about Martin Luther King and about Mandela and Vietnam. At the end, we're taking pictures together out on the front steps, and they became our friends. And then the next Saturday, I preached in a small church. They gave a gift to us, and we were on the front row. So interesting experience, but just to be aware that they're there. We stopped off at a little church with no plan to stop there. And they've found us there. Here we all were. Anyway.
When you talk about preaching the gospel, there are 2 tasks. The one task is building the army. That's what I like to say. In other words, seeking people who are ready to commit totally to what the church is about and to give their lives to it. And that's the traditional evangelism. But the second type of gospel is reaching out to those who influence the world. Changing the culture. And that's the kind of thing you were doing there. You were taking people that have a lot of influence in that country and opening their minds to the possibilities that they might not otherwise have thought of. That's not going to get marked, down as, okay, here's a new accession to the church. But it may, in the long run, have even a bigger impact than the other kind of work in that country.
I'm sure I'm not supposed to say a lot, but I'll say there's at least one of those people who has been the one we talked to get, connections with over the years, not me, our mission people. And he is a believer now. And family supports what we do. And he does both roles. He's still there, and he's still supporting us. And I did not meet him, but I heard the story. So you hope and pray that God will use these doors and openings. And I love the country. We had a terrific time in the country.
Well, I was just going to say, I think that's like the premise of believing in something beyond ourselves, is realizing that people are still people, even if you have differing views. Yeah. And I think sometimes we go in and we're like, oh, we're going to save their souls, or we're going to save this community, when really, they're not different than us, and we may be scared of what they may think or do, in the sense of, what if they pulled your permit and you weren't allowed to speak? But at the same time, treating them like humans and being kind.
Yes.
That's what I think God is asking us to do. That's what Jesus lived. And he didn't just bulldoze everyone and say, like, you have to do this. He lived kindly and let people be in their space, and he joined them in their space. And I think that's a testament to actual mission service, is going in and becoming part of the community, even if you're doing something that makes them uncomfortable.
I shook hands with 800 people for the nights we were in that church, the big church. Just like a politician, there were no other doors out. So at my door, they all came, just grabbing us, wanting to again smile. Not one of them could say a word to me or me to them.
Absolutely.
And I shook hands with 800 every single night, 4 nights in a row. And I heard that that's what they talked about. They said he was always smiling and always greeting us.
Right.
At the last church, I could see the pastor telling them to shake hands. They didn't know to do that. They had never done this before. I'm the first white man that they've been around like this. And he would say, shake their hand. So I would shake hands, and then they, okay. They didn't know. They didn't know. That's what we do. And just good experiences. Anyway, baptized a few people in this place. Anyway, please get out a Bible. We're here in Revelation. If you didn't know, we're doing Revelation book by book, verse by verse, chapter by chapter. And we are ready to read the last couple of verses of Revelation 5. This is the throne room vision, if you've lost track of where we are. And we had the ascending, broadening choir going from the 4 living creatures to the 24 elders to the 28, singing a new song, and then the angels. We've mentioned this, but let's just read it again and then kind of go over phrase by phrase. So Revelation 5, starting with verse 13 and 14. Then I heard every creature in heaven and on earth and under the earth and on the sea and all that is in them singing, to him who sits on the throne and to the Lamb be praise and honor and glory and power forever and ever. And the 4 living creatures said, Amen. And the elders fell down and worshiped. So I was doing a worship one time with my fellow college pastors, who you know, many of them. And the pastor of your church, when you were in Michigan, said to me, he said, because I said this meant every creature. Every creature meant every creature is bowing down and worshiping God. And he wanted to say, unbelievers cannot worship. They can acquiesce. They can, okay, but not worship. They're worshiping. So he didn't want to accept my idea that this means that every creature, like in Philippians where it says every knee will bow, every tongue will confess. Do you think this is every? 108 billion. All the angels, all the demons, Satan are going to acknowledge God. That's what I was saying. He was saying, no, only the believers can worship.
I suppose it depends on what you mean by worship. Doesn't it say in Philippians, to me every knee will bow and every tongue confess? Now, maybe it's saying some, but that word is available in the Greek language. And Paul didn't choose to use it, neither did John here. So at some point, you have to deal with what the text says. There may be another way of explaining it. Now, I personally think that if we have a God who cares about truth, who cares about being understood, this would forecast a time when everybody kind of says, God was right in this thing. Do you think Satan could say that? Could he come to the place where he wouldn't change his mind, about what he wants to do for himself, but he recognizes, no, God truly is the way he claimed to be. And I would see the parallel to this in chapter 20. At the end of chapter 20, it suggests there is a moment, maybe we should read it. There is a moment in the future when everyone who's ever lived will be in the same place at the same time. That has never happened before, and I guess will never happen again. But in chapter 20, starting with verse 7, it says, when the 1,000 years are completed, Satan will be released from his prison and will come out to deceive the nations which are in the 4 corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, to gather them together for war. The number of them is like the sand of the seashore. And they came up on the broad plain of the earth and surrounded the camp of the saints and the beloved city, and fire came down from heaven and devoured them. And the devil who deceived them was thrown in the lake of fire, and so on. So it doesn't say any more than that everybody, all of those who have opposed God, will be there at that moment. And they'll be surrounding the city, which will contain everybody in all of history that's ever supported God. So you're going to have everybody there. Now, it doesn't go into, will they bow the knee? But there you have Philippians 2 that says the time is coming when every knee will bow.
Yeah.
So the way I've envisioned that, and some important writings that have influenced me when I was younger, is the idea that God will at that moment do kind of like a panorama, like the greatest movie ever, that will give the big picture of everything that's ever happened, and that every person will have a sense of the part they played in this larger controversy. In other words, there'll be no more secrets, no more prophetic surprises. This will be the moment when there's no more surprises, but everybody sees clearly. And at that point, some will still, say, well, I see clearly, and praise God for that. And others will see clearly and say, yeah, but I'm still living for me.
Right. That's right.
Well,
That's
I would
right.
like to point out two things. One, look, he's using a commoner's book as opposed to his fancy computer with 8,000 languages on it. And the second thing I was going to say is I think it's interesting because the question again was, what kind of worship are we talking about? Because I don't know if you guys have ever been to a concert, not that I've ever been to one, but when you're in a room full of people watching something similarly, you can't help but kind of join the movement of the crowd a lot of the time, right? So if you're in standing room only and people are moving, you tend to just kind of go with them. It's like being on the metro in Russia. Like, you're there, you all move at the same time, but no one really falls over, And so if there's this big act of worship, sometimes you can't help but being caught up in those moments. So I think everyone could theoretically get caught up in that moment, whether or not they believe.
That's really a painful comment to me, because we just recently celebrated my son's birthday, and he chose his birthday present as a Newsboys concert.
Yes, I heard about this.
Yeah.
I like the Newsboys.
Well,
Is the guy with the really big blonde hair still there? Because he was my favorite.
It may be. I couldn't see from, we were in the nosebleed section, but anyway, that was deliberate, because the previous concert I went to, I thought my chest was caving in from the bass and everything. So I barely survived, So wow. I understand what you're saying, but that when you're talking about worship, James tells us that Satan knows that God is powerful, more powerful than he is, and it scares him. You see, is there a sense of worship like that? Can a person just be in awe of somebody so big and so powerful that you're in absolute terror? That wouldn't be worship in the ideal sense, but it would be recognizing there's somebody bigger than you here.
That's respect.
Ultimately, worship is awe in the presence of someone bigger than you are.
Any of us on this side of the country who follow football hate Tom Brady and the New England Patriots.
What?
They've been, they're the other team, but you just have to acknowledge greatness. They've just been so good for so long. And in the championship game, year after year after year after year, James has been in the championship game 6 seasons in a row. You just have to acknowledge that. If it isn't your favorite player, not your favorite team, you may not want to say, I am now a Cleveland Cavaliers fan or Tom Brady, but you have to acknowledge greatness. They're just fantastic athletes and coach. And I think Satan and those people will have to do that. They'll just have to say, we hate it. They just through clenched teeth. They will just have, but they have to acknowledge.
He won't acknowledge
greatness.
the character of God. He won't embrace forgiveness and love and self-sacrifice. Won't embrace any of that, but he'll recognize, I'm defeated here.
I think that goes back to kind of what I said earlier about going in people's spaces. When you go and you treat people well, they may not agree with your theological views, but they can acknowledge that you're a good person or that you're living well. And so I know I've been told a lot of times, like, I don't agree with your theology, I don't agree with your belief system whatsoever, but I don't mind hanging out with you, And so I think it's the same concept, is like, maybe they won't, be happy about what's happening, but acknowledging that goodness and the greatness.
Just can't help it. You have to
take a step back and be in awe.
I don't know if I've said this story here, but my little picture of this, There was a chapel that last year when I was pastor there that I went to many, many years ago. And a men's chorus came from Ukraine. I can't remember anything more about it, but they were fantastic. They were fantastic. And to have college kids just jump up when it was over, just say, that was incredible. Every single person in the whole chapel at La Sierra Church was standing, except one kid sitting in the back. I'm standing by the door. And this one kid had a little novel, and he was reading his novel. He hadn't listened to any of it. And friends on either side of him were not going to have this. This is going to be a complete standing ovation. And they grabbed him by both shoulders and pulled him up so that it was every single person standing ovation. So I see it like that Satan will be the
Someone's
last.
going to grab Satan and raise him up.
Yeah. But it's a reluctant standing ovation. But he will have to acknowledge. And that is part of the firewall against any of this happening again, that we will all remember that even Satan acknowledged the question was over. He had to answer the question. God is right, God is good, God is true.
Well, and that's an important concept, because if you believe that the universe is free, and yet that one day sin will be no more, at some point the thing has to be so clear that no one will question it again.
Yeah.
And that's the reason, I think, for dragging things on as long as it seems that they've happened, because there needs to be enough evidence on which to make that permanent choice that will keep the universe safe for eternity.
This is a crazy segue, but there was an article in Christianity Today years ago after the last Harry Potter novel came out. Now, I'm sure many people would say, how can you get anything good out of Harry Potter? And I'm not going to argue that. This is Christianity Today that wrote that, not me. But they said at the end of the 7 Harry Potter books, it has witchcraft everywhere in it, but it has a Christ figure, and it has an evil figure, and it has great controversy and all this battle. And at the end, in the final few pages of 7 books about this stuff, he has had a scar all his life, and whenever evil was around, the scar hurt. And now, evidently, at the end of these 7 books, the scar hadn't hurt in 15 or 20 years. Meaning, the evil was gone. This presence of evil around, that whenever it was, it just had this reaction to him, was gone. And Christianity Today said, how did that get in there? How did it get in a set of books about witchcraft? Did the writer mean for that to be in there? Or did it just come from her unconscious archetypal story of the great controversy that's in here? And they quoted C.S. Lewis from Chronicles of Narnia, which is similar. And they asked C.S. Lewis, did you intend for this all to be an allegory between Aslan and evil and victory and people sitting with Christ on the thrones and wicked witch of the north and all of that? He said, I never planned any of that, but it wouldn't stay out. Great quote. Is that when it is part of your system of thought, it comes in. So I keep thinking, Ellen White writes in the last chapter, the great paragraph, the great controversy is ended, sin and sinners are no more. One pulse of harmony, rings everywhere. And that somehow, even in movies and in the arts and literature, that sense of closure, that it's all wrapped up. And there's only good and evil has been wiped out.
I think human beings are designed to long for peace and harmony and love and to shun that which undermines it. There's something in us, and we're frustrated by the evil and the corruption and so on in the world, and yet we find ourselves engaged in it.
Absolutely.
Against our will, and this creates a tremendous sense of loss and longing.
But this is a hope that someday those cycles will be over. There will not be another 007 movie. They have their good and evil, and then finally evil is vanquished, and he's out in a boat with a girl or whatever, and all is good in the world. And then the next year, the next movie comes up, and there's another chaos and another terrible group of people. And eventually the cycles will be over, and we won't need another James Bond to do it. What else needs to come from this verse, Revelation 5? When is this every knee will bow and every creature? When in cosmic history?
Well, clearly that's an anticipation of something that has not happened in chapter 6 or chapter 7 or chapter 8 or chapter 9. This is a glimpse forward of something that is not yet a reality at the time of chapter 5. So that, I think, this is the moment that we see here is the moment after Revelation 20, when sin is gone and the universe is clean and a new earth is present. That's the time when this, I think, ultimately universal praise and worship and peace and harmony will occur.
Will there be growth after that? Someone asked me. She said to me, we learn because we feel lack now. I don't know, so I want to read to know. Will we grow in that environment? Will we feel pain because I don't know something? Or will it be completely resolved? We will feel whole and complete forever, now that everything has been solved and all evil is gone. No tear, there'll be no more tears. Or will there ever be a sense of incompleteness? Boy, I would like to know that, go there, know those people, ask that question. Answer that. Mm-hmm. I had no answer for it.
Isn't that why God created? Because even God wanted to grow? I mean, growth comes in interaction with others. As we learn from each other, we grow and new things develop in relationship.
Will the sense of
when
lack
God created free creatures.
Will the sense of lack be painful, or will there be no more pain?
Well, it says no more pain, so let's assume that a sense of lack leads us to filling the lack, and that the ways are there available to us.
Okay, so there's no pain.
Or do you think God is static?
I think it's hard to know for sure, because a lot of this is historical documents that we are contemplating. And so I think it's interesting just because the definitive statements that I think people want, I never feel comfortable giving, because I don't know if it's in here. Like, I don't understand sometimes how people get to such absolutes about things when very often it's not an absolute statement, because we don't know. Like, we're theorizing.
Well, let me tell you how I came to the conviction that God grows and develops.
Okay, please do tell.
And
see,
that
I can get along with
I wrote a book called What the Bible Says About the End Time. And I thought, unlike books that start with what we think is going to happen and then try to prove it from the Bible, I simply said, let's go to Noah. What would the end look like to Noah? What evidence does there take? What about Moses? What was his view of the end? What about David? What about the prophets? What about Paul? What about John? So I sort of went, a journey through the Old Testament and through history, and wrote the book and thought it was great, and sent it out there, and then people started responding with stuff that I hadn't put in there. And they said, wow, that book is revolutionary, changes everything. How prophecy shifts all the way through. And I said, I didn't say that. They said, yes, you did. And there were other people saw in my book implications that I did not see when I wrote it.
Right.
And a discovery that every picture of the end was a natural extension of that prophet's time and place. And that the view of the end shifted from era to era through the Bible.
Right.
And I came to realize that God meets people where they are, and that God is interacting, and that's why there's such a thing as conditional prophecy. If God says, you're doomed, and the nation repents, he's not going to do the doom. And if God says, you're the good guys, and you're going to get all these rewards, and then they run away from God, he says, I'm not going to do all those good things that I promised to you. So God is engaged with his creation, and God shifts to accommodate where the creation is heading. And to me, it's a scary concept, but it's a very exciting concept, that you take away sin, you take away rebellion, and that growth means that heaven will never be boring.
Right, and that also is where a lot of my friends then argue, like, predestination versus not. And this is where I think there's a case for you're not necessarily forced into any direct path, because God moves with us and allows the movements that we're in as well. So that's why I think it's hard sometimes to interpret the Bible definitively, because it's interpretive in a lot of senses.
Well, let me do an analogy. If there's one thing that God creates that hasn't been super distorted, it would be snowflakes. Okay? Because, I mean, snowflakes are snowflakes, right? They were probably there on some planet before sin was, and they'll be there on some planet afterward. You know, it'll be just fun to go on the skiing planet or whatever God has in view. But snowflakes are evidence of God's love of tremendous variety, because no two snowflakes are alike. And that's stunning to realize how many billions of snowflakes are there just in 1 square foot of snow. And then all the snowflakes that we know about in the universe, no two have ever been alike. And that tells me that God is committed to variety, that God is committed to growth and development, you see. And when we read the Bible carefully and exegetically, that's the kind of God we see. And it's a God who gave freedom to his creatures because it would enable fresh creativity. It limited God. His ability to control everything was limited, but he's not a control freak. And he, I think, delights in his creation because new stuff is popping up every day. Right. And never be boring.
Well, and not to go backwards, and you can totally correct me if this is a weird turn of events, but like if you talk about everyone worshiping then, that's got to be weird for people that just heard what you said, because if God's not a control freak and doesn't need everyone to worship him at that moment, and it's not a forced thing, then what's the point of that statement?
So the purpose of worship is because God needs it?
Well, I think we need it more than him, but that's why.
Next show.
You know, as I think we are hardwired. I'm reading a book right now called Reality is Broken. And our School of Religion's doing this for book club, and we're actually going to do this in a couple of days. But it is a book written by a game designer, one of the world's greatest game designers, computer games. All right, involved with Halo and some of these other things, World of Warcraft and so on. And this person's also a positive psychologist, has a PhD in positive psychology. And basically says in that book, she's not a believer. She basically says in that book that meaning comes from awe, and awe means being in the presence of something or someone greater than yourself.
Cool.
And that human beings cannot be happy, cannot be truly fulfilled, cannot find meaning in life unless they're willing to give themselves up to something bigger than themselves. And that's why World of Warcraft and Halo are so big, because it draws people into this whole universe where there's millions of people involved, and they realize this is something huge.
Absolutely.
So we need worship, and God lets us have it.
That's cool.
You tied it together. I was gonna pull this off, but he did. Great stuff, Jon. Great stuff. I'm sorry, we're come to an end. So we're going to meet again, well, at least one more on chapter 5. We'll try to do the sanctuary thing that we talked about. We want to study that theme. We're down to just a few seconds, so thank you for being with us today. One of the great chapters, chapter 5, and then we're going to go one more time on that next week. Please be with us on GPS.